Welcome back to the AI Policy Podcast. This is our first video episode where Greg and I will discuss all the matters of the day regarding AI policy. Greg, good to see you on video.
Good to see you and to be seen by you.
Well, this is fun. So let's discuss, we're going to talk today about XAI's Grok 3. We're going to talk about DOGE and how it's affecting the federal AI workforce or not affecting it. We'll talk about the Xi Jinping meeting with Chinese AI executives. And finally, we're going to get into the Evo 2 model and what it means for the future of biology. But first, Greg, let's talk about Elon Musk. Everybody's talking about Elon Musk, but they're talking about him mostly for DOGE. But before we do that, let's talk about the release of XAI, the new Grok 3 model. February 17th, the Musk company XAI released its Grok 3 family of models. What do we know about these models so far, and what are their capabilities?
So I think the first thing is what went into these models. And this was trained on an upgraded version of the Colossus supercomputer cluster, which XAI built in Memphis, Tennessee. It contains roughly 200,000 NVIDIA Hopper GPUs. So this is the most powerful supercomputer on Earth that went into training this AI model. By the way, it runs on like entirely diesel fuel. It's kind of controversial, like the energy consumption of this, and they're fighting with the local government about that thing. But we're going to talk instead about the performance aspect of this. Because if you recall from our earlier conversations...
But we'll talk about energy another time, and we'll bring our buddy Joseph Mikut on to talk about energy and AI, which we have talked about on this podcast before.
Yeah, definitely. But for now, I think what's interesting is before there was a bunch of different questions about what was the future sources of AI performance improvement. And Grok 3 right now out there is doing very well on a lot of the benchmarks that people in this industry care about. Now, there is sort of this speculation in the industry about, well, maybe benchmarks don't mean as much now as they used to because everybody's aiming at them so hard that you're really optimizing for doing well in these metrics as opposed to the kind of intelligence that actually reflects what users are going to experience when they interact with the model. So I think that's one thing. But there is this broader question of what is going to continue driving improved AI performance, and what does Grok tell us about that fact? So NVIDIA, I think, helpfully sort of spelled this out after the DeepSeek debate, where they said there's effectively 3 different sources of additional AI performance that relates to the amount of computing. So the first is the pre-training, which is, you download the entire internet, you run a next token prediction learning algorithm on it, and that is insanely computationally intensive. Then there's the post-training, which is like fine-tuning, turning it into a great model, optimizing for certain capabilities that you care about, perhaps with additional reinforcement learning type techniques. And then finally, there is the test time compute, which is beefing up the amount of computation that you use for each individual user answer. So not creating a better model, but using the model with more horsepower behind it, you could sort of say. And Grok 3 is the first experiment that we've seen somebody run for an additional scaling up of the pre-training of the model. So it is going to it used more than 10 to the 26th flops in training it. So that quantity of compute, that's a 10 with 26 zeros after it. This is a jaw-dropping amount of computation. Right, that's basically turning on all 200,000 of those GPUs and running them for a really, really long time.
Let me ask you a question, though. How many supercomputers in the United States and in the world are there that can do this?
So in terms of the actual scale that it's at, the answer is 0. This is the largest supercomputer out there. Mm-hmm. But in terms of, the number of supercomputing clusters that could theoretically do this if you gave them more time, if you ran the GPUs for longer, et cetera, there's quite a few clusters at this point, something like a dozen. And then there's other supercomputing clusters that have a huge number of chips, but they don't use them to train frontier AI models. This is like the stuff that exists at the Department of Energy or that predicts, weather patterns, those other kind of supercomputing things.
And Greg, I'm assuming we're not the only country that has this. I'm assuming China has it as well.
So China's largest supercomputers don't come close, really, to what Grok has right here. And that's partly a function of the AI chip export controls. So, for example, DeepSeek, which is China's leading frontier AI lab, they have, according to SemiAnalysis, which is pretty well sourced in the semiconductor supply chain, they have 50,000 Hopper GPUs, but not all of those are H800s or H100s. A lot of those are H20s, which are really not great for training models. And when you think about what DeepSeek trained on, they claimed that it was about 2,048 GPUs operating, for a long period of time. So the amount of computational power that's going into Grok 3 dwarfs that of what was used, not just for DeepSeek, which was deliberately tiny, but also for what OpenAI used for GPT-4. So this really is the first model to come out of the gate as a next generation 10x scaling up of the amount of computation used to train the base model. And what's interesting there, and I think it's worth pointing out what some of the other commentators in this area have said. I thought some comments coming out of Epoch AI were actually Epoch AI were really interesting on this point. So I'm just going to read the quote because I think it is quite insightful.
Sure.
It is possible to make both a bullish and a bearish case for scaling based on Grok 3. The bullish case is that Grok 3 is indeed state-of-the-art as a base model with a meaningful margin between it and the second best models, and this is what we would expect given its status as a next-generation model, with around 3e to the 26th flops of training compute. The bearish case is that the gap between Grok 3 and models such as Claude 3.5 Sonnet seems much smaller than the gap between GPT-4 and GPT 3.5, despite both representing roughly an order of magnitude of compute difference. So what they're basically getting at here is that Grok is a 10x of the amount of computation going into the pre-training phase of this base model. But the last time we did a 10xing of the amount of compute going into the base model, which was between GPT 3.5 and GPT-4, we got a really significant performance plus up, and this performance plus up does not seem to be as significant. Now, part of that could be just because XAI is a relatively young company. They're barely a year old. And so maybe they don't have a lot of the other secret sauce, ways to increase performance currently incorporated into it. And so once we do that, perhaps we'll see the performance margin increasing. But I think we might get a data point even sooner than that, which is OpenAI CEO Sam Altman has said that GPT 4.5, which I'm assuming is going to have sort of a roughly comparable amount of pre-training computation going into it, is coming out in a matter of weeks.
Well, yeah, and that's what I was going to ask you is how does it stack up against OpenAI? And, let's just be frank, Elon Musk tried to buy OpenAI in the last several weeks, months, and was told no.
He was told no. And there's so much of what this means about what the nature of competitive advantage in AI is. What does it mean that a company like XAI can just waltz into the industry, start from more or less scratch, and in 1 year, they're basically peers to the global state of the art, the people who've been working on this for 10 plus years. On the flip side is we'll see. We'll see what it looks like when OpenAI delivers something that has, 10 to the 26th flops in its overall computation. One thing that's worth noting here is that this is the first model to cross that performance.
Can I stop you?
Go ahead.
Explain what flops actually are.
Oh, floating point operations. It's basically a count of the number of computations that are involved.
Thank you for us, laymen out there.
All good. Basically, it's a count of computing power, how much computing power was used to train a model or to run inference on a model. But the point is that has sort of been the metric that people have been adhering to as they're asking themselves, how do we look at what the different generations of models are? Because there's the naming conventions, which at most of these companies makes no sense whatsoever. And then there's the actual, generations of models. So this is the first next generation model, you could say. And one thing that I think is really important is that in the past, that has been tied to regulatory outcomes.
So this is why it's significant that they're first.
Exactly. Well, yes. So, for example, the EU AI Act, a lot of their provisions kicked in with the current generation of models based on 10 to the 25th flops being used for training. But if you look at the Biden administration's AI executive order, a lot of their provisions didn't kick in till 10 to the 26th flops. So that's the generation that we're currently on. And even though the Trump administration got rid of that Biden administration executive order, there are other things out there in government policy that still reflect this threshold. Most notably, the AI diffusion rule, which was sort of that last gasp of Biden administration export control policy. And there was a hardware component of that, which dealt with the chips, and there was a software component of that, which dealt with the models. And that model, again, was tied to this 10 to the 26th threshold. So if the AI diffusion rule goes into effect, as it is currently slated to do, unless the Trump administration stops it, it is going to have implications for how XAI internationalizes their model. Not in terms of serving the model, like giving customers somewhere else access to it, but literally if they were to hypothetically build a data center in another country and then move an instantiation of their model to it, it is now past that power and performance threshold where the regulations start kicking in.
All right, so we're going to have to keep watching this. And now, every time I see somebody flop in the NBA, I think of AI, right?
Yeah.
All right.
And the NFL lately, too.
Oh, don't get me started about the NFL. And sorry about your Kansas City Chiefs, by the way.
It was a hard time for all of us.
Sorry, not sorry. Anyway, Greg, let's get on to the next topic, which is the federal AI workforce under the Trump administration. A lot of commotion in town here about DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency initiative, and the Trump administration's significantly reducing the size of the federal workforce. On February 19th, Bloomberg and other outlets reported that NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, which houses the AI Safety Institute, was preparing to fire about 500 staffers. What are some of the implications of this, Greg?
Well, I think this is a pretty remarkable thing to say you want. If you are somebody who is like Elon Musk, who's leading the DOGE initiative, it's really worth paying attention to some of his prior statements. He is on the record saying that there is something like a 10 to 20% chance that AI leads to the extinction of humanity. He, in November 2023, was interviewed by British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak on the stage of the UK AI Safety Summit, and he tweeted in promoting that summit, AI safety is vital to the future of civilization. Well, where is the US AI Safety Institute housed? It's housed at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology.
Right, which is not an agency that many people know about.
It's like one of the underappreciated gems of the United States government. It's, it does a ton of different stuff that it turns out is really useful. It's actually usually beloved by industry, right? Because standards basically mean, okay, we don't have to, have 1,000 different negotiations of what kind of, USB cord we're going to use when we want to be interchangeable.
They say this is what it is. Everybody uses what it is.
Yes, we have a mechanism whereby government convenes the right people to come up with technical standards, with measurement standards, et cetera. People at NIST have won Nobel Prizes. I mean, they do really great work.
And let's just make clear. These are not your typical bureaucrats. When you think of what a bureaucrat is, these are very highly technical, as you said, Nobel Prize winners, highly, highly trained people.
The type of people who, when I was in government, we often complained about our inability to recruit people who were that good, right?
Yep.
And NIST does have a mechanism
DOD.
whereby they can bring in really great people. And it connects to AI safety because NIST has been staffing up over the past few years, trying to bring in more AI expertise, because that was an area where they had, a really small and high-performing team that worked on things like the NIST AI Risk Management Framework, which is a framework that is beloved by most parts of the US AI industry. But that team was small, and so they tried to scale it up, and they tried to bring in these AI safety and security type concerns along with the talent to support that kind of work. And the challenge for DOGE is they are so prioritizing shrinking the government that they're looking for what are all the easiest levers that you can pull to shrink government. Well, in the case of federal employees, there's a probationary period whereby it's easy to fire you if you've been less than 3 years, less than 2 years, whatever. But it's hard to fire you if you've been there for longer. So when you pull that lever of fire all the probationary employees, what you're effectively doing is you're gutting the AI and semiconductor talent that is resident at places like NIST. So the exact places where we want more experts to come into government, where everybody has been saying it's a very bipartisan phenomenon supporting this, this could be a huge mistake. Now, what's being reported in the press and what I believe to be true based on conversations with folks who are at the U.S. AI Safety Institute or folks who are in Congress who are working on these issues, I think there might be a gap here. And the reason why I say that is, first off, Howard Lutnick, who is now the Secretary of Commerce, in his confirmation hearing, he expressed glowing praise for NIST. I mean, here's what he said, quote, NIST has some of the greatest scientists in the world, and they understand AI technology. This is an essential hub of knowledge of the American government, which I'm really excited to oversee. So does that sound like a guy who can't wait for DOGE to come in and fire all these people? No, I hope not. And my hope here is that it's actually not even a fight, that Elon Musk leading DOGE is pro AI safety, and Howard Lutnick leading the Department of Commerce is pro having AI expertise in the federal government. And so I'm hoping there's a gap between what's being reported and what is real. But let's just say it is real, that DOGE is trying to really shrink the Department of Commerce and fire all these probationary employees, including all the AI experts that they've brought in.
And we don't know if they've fired anybody yet, correct?
I don't believe they have. No. I mean, for the head of the U.S. AI Safety Institute, Elizabeth Kelly, has resigned, but that was a resignation, not a termination.
Right.
I think this could be one of those areas where we're seeing a little bit of pushback between the Trump appointees and the DOGE initiative. So, for example, there was this email that went out a couple days ago where Elon Musk said, every federal employee needs to respond to this email saying what they've done over the past week. And if you don't respond to this, you're going to be fired. Well, you've seen Trump appointees like Kash Patel, who now runs the FBI. He said, do not respond to that email. We run our personnel system here in the FBI. They're not in charge of our personnel system. So I could imagine a situation where somebody like Lutnick, who's expressed such praise and admiration for NIST, would really push back if DOGE did try to make good on a massive shrinking of this AI talent pool. I'm sure that they're going to have the same kind of, anti-woke, anti-DEI purges that we've seen in places like the Department of Defense and elsewhere. But there's a big difference between that and the kind of AI technical talent that the government has been trying to bring in.
So I have to ask, is there bipartisan consensus up on the Hill that we need to keep AI safety workers in place, that we need to keep NIST in place? Is that one of those things that the Congress might push back on as well?
So I think on NIST as a whole, yes, there's absolutely a bipartisan consensus that NIST should survive. Now, the AI Safety Institute at NIST, I don't think there's a bipartisan consensus that it should remain unchanged. Basically, there are folks who, as we've said on this podcast many times, where in Republican politics, the word AI safety is viewed as toxic because the word safety is viewed as toxic. It's viewed as a synonym for political censorship. But there's other things like the security parts of the story where I think there's something much more approaching a bipartisan consensus, right? We do not want anybody to just be able to throw out an AI model that can teach an 18-year-old how to make a bioweapon, right? There's certain things that we don't want people getting AI help on. And so those kind of security aspects, I do think there is bipartisan support. Of note, there was a big letter that was circulated on Capitol Hill that had, more than 60 signatures, including a lot of the leading AI companies. They were talking about the importance of preserving the U.S. AI Safety Institute. And notably, Scale AI, not a signatory to that letter, but they sent their own letter, again, endorsing the AI Safety Institute. And Michael Kratsios, who's going to be the incoming head of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, he used to be the managing director at Scale AI. So I think these things, from my perspective, I think there's a gap between what's being reported in the media and what is reality. And I hope that's true, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
All right, let's move on to DOD. On February 20th, new Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth directed the Pentagon to identify $50 billion in programs that could be cut to fund President Trump's defense priorities. What does this mean for the DOD AI ecosystem, a system that you were a big part of when you were in government?
Yeah, so I know this ecosystem pretty well, and I think it's kind of what I would have expected. If you look at what the Trump administration has been saying, they've very consistently been saying that they love the military, that they want to increase defense spending, but they hate the existing defense industrial base, right? They basically see a bunch of companies that are basically, these vampiric parasites that are
Feeding
sucking
off
money
federal
out of the
government.
Department of Defense and not converting that money into military power at a very efficient rate. So this quote unquote 8% cut is actually not a cut. What it is it's saying we're going to cut 8% of the programs, 8% of the dollars of the budget, but we're going to reinvest 100% of what we cut. We're just going to move from programs that we don't like to programs that we do like. And it's worth noting that Hegseth, that list that was put out by the Secretary of Defense, included 17 programs that they're not going to include in that 8% cut target. And 2 of them were very big, noteworthy AI military programs. That is the Collaborative Combat Aircraft, which is the Air Force's flagship autonomous aircraft, fighter aircraft program, and then also this program called One-Way Attack Autonomous Systems. So just yet another example of incorporating AI and autonomy into military capabilities.
Yeah.
I think that more broad than that, I just expect the AI to be a big beneficiary of this overall reprioritization, because when they cut from that 8%, what are they going to reinvest in? They're going to reinvest in these types of capabilities that they think actually has a shot at deterring Russia, deterring China, and not in capabilities that, help spread the money around and build political goodwill by buying off 50 senators.
Well, you have to think with Elon Musk and other technology people in President Trump's orbit, they would explain and underscore the necessity, the need for this kind of apparatus within DOD, within NIST, et cetera.
Yep. And I think there's one other part of this story that I think is really noteworthy. A February 20th article in Defense One was interviewing an anonymous DOD official, part of the Trump administration, who was saying that they're going to reorganize the Strategic Capabilities Office, the Defense Innovation Unit, and the Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office. And they're going to create some kind of new body that is, quote, the commercial engineering version of DARPA. So that's this new body through which they can run joint programs focused on capabilities like, literally, this is what the official said, according to the article, autonomous killer robots, and other kinds of capabilities that are downstream of progress in AI. Say again, Aaron?
We've talked about this on podcast before, autonomous killer robots. That's a popular subject.
But it is noteworthy that this is the first time I've seen the military embracing the moniker killer robots. Historically, that's not the way that we framed our investments in military autonomy capabilities. Well, it is the way a lot of our political enemies framed it, though.
Well, and it's working in pop culture, I suppose.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on. I want to talk about Xi Jinping. He met with Chinese AI executives February 17th, including DeepSeek CEO Lang Wenfeng. What was the purpose of this meeting, and who was there besides DeepSeek?
So I think that this meeting was downstream of the DeepSeek revelations, that happened in January, but it wasn't necessarily only about DeepSeek. It was really about the broader Chinese technology ecosystem. I think a super notable presence there was Alibaba CEO Jack Ma. Right? This is a guy who was basically excommunicated from the Chinese Communist Party for getting too big for his britches and pissing off Xi Jinping by, disparaging the actions of the Chinese government. Well, he's now been rehabilitated. So he's back into the fold of power, and his invitation and his prominent seating at this meeting kind of suggests that. So that's about trying to say that the Chinese Communist Party is kind of walking back the tech crackdown that they had, embarked upon around 2 years ago, and now they're trying to be a good place to invest. It's noteworthy that the Chinese equivalent of the NASDAQ, their more tech-focused stock exchange, it's been up a lot since the DeepSeek, revelations, and it has stayed high. And venture capitalists are excited again. And overall, the Chinese government is basically saying, we are doubling down on high tech. We are doubling down on, the what they call in their system, the new productive forces, stuff like electric cars, stuff like advanced semiconductors. So they're going all in. And this meeting was meant to send that signal to the broader entrepreneurial ecosystem that this is a good time to invest in China.
All right. So the release of this, Greg, generated an enormous amount of headlines here in the United States, but it also created a significant amount of news regarding DeepSeek's adoption in China over the past couple of weeks as well. So what can you tell us about the reception to DeepSeek among Chinese firms and government institutions there?
I think Chinese local government offices, Chinese companies are like falling over themselves to demonstrate how they are incorporating DeepSeek into their products. You know, Chinese car maker BYD is saying that DeepSeek models are going to be a part of its driver assistance system. Baidu is saying that DeepSeek is going to be added to their search engine. Tencent is saying that DeepSeek is going to be a part of their social media platforms. Now, what's noteworthy is a lot of these companies make their own AI models, right? But they're saying, who cares? DeepSeek is obviously the best Chinese model. It's obviously something that is really resonating with the public. And we want to suggest that we are doing it and that we are part of the Chinese team, because that's what that meeting really was, is it was basically highlighting this is the Chinese team of technology giants. And I thought what was so interesting was the comments of Ren Zhengfei, the founder of Huawei, who was there. He was saying that, you know, his level of concern about stuff like the U.S. export controls, which he was, you know, on the record publicly saying was still really, really problematic for him as late as Q4 of last year. He basically said that, you know, we, Huawei, have made breakthroughs. We've been organizing the Chinese semiconductor ecosystem, and we think that we're headed for 70% self-sufficiency by 2028. So he's expressing a really bullish vision for China's future in semiconductors, China's future in AI. They're trying to project confidence that they can do this all by themselves.
Interesting. That's something we're going to need to follow as well. Finally, today, we want to talk about Stanford, NVIDIA, and the ARC Institute release, Evo 2. On February 19th, so much has been going on the last couple of weeks since we, did our last podcast. February 19th, researchers from Stanford, NVIDIA, and the ARC Institute released Evo 2, which is a new foundation model trained on a data set containing roughly 128,000 genomes. Greg, what do we know about this model so far, and how is it different from other kinds of cutting-edge AI that we've talked about on this show?
I think this model really highlights why there has been such a bullish confidence in the future of the intersection of AI and biology.
Yeah.
Because, AI really loves when you have a really large training data set, and maybe you don't know everything about all of the different aspects of your data, but as long as your data set is good and as long as it is big, AI will figure out interesting things about the data set, even if you human scholars, cannot. So here what we have is an example of this massive data set of a bunch of bacterial DNA, a bunch of eukaryotic DNA sequences, and they basically just throw it in the blender with AI to analyze it. And what comes out is an AI model that can just look at the DNA sequence of any bacteria that exists, or even a hypothetical bacteria that does not exist. And they can say, if we were hypothetically to introduce these mutations, the bacteria would die. If we were hypothetically to introduce these other mutations, the bacteria would gain some kind of new capability that it might not otherwise have. It's really this incredible degree of, you could almost call it like simulated experimentation, right? Historically, if we wanted to know what a change in DNA would do to an organism, we would have to create that organism, then we would have to modify its DNA, then we would have to, go put that modified DNA organism in an environment and, observe effectively what happens to it with that new modified DNA. Here, we're so basically this AI model is so sophisticated in its ability to predict based on DNA alone, the sort of real world consequences of DNA changes, that it is just an incredible amount of insight into the future of what this looks like. And this, of course, has medical applications. So according to the ARC Institute, one of the key institutions behind this research, they said, quote, in tests of variants of the breast cancer associating gene BRCA1, Evo 2 achieved 90% accuracy in predicting which mutations are benign versus potentially pathogenic. So insights like this are really, really valuable. And I think that this is basically taking all of that wet lab experimentation that is so expensive in time and so expensive in money, and it's offering an AI alternative for identifying the most promising, lines of research, the most promising candidates. It's a really incredible breakthrough. And I don't think we're done. I mean, I think this is just going to keep happening because we're now at this level of sophistication of AI where we can do stuff like this.
I mean, this sounds like it's straight out of science fiction. I mean,
I think it's
right out of Dune. I mean,
yes.
Bene Gesserit actually had a system like this.
Well, yeah, but they were doing selective breeding. But yeah, I think it's amazing. And even when you just look at NVIDIA's quote about this, Evo is able to perform zero shot function prediction for genes. That line, like zero shot prediction, which basically means that we don't need to create it in the real world. We can just, on our first try, sort of predict what's going to happen, what these genes are going to do in the real world. That is like literally a sci-fi use case for AI that I would have talked about 5 years ago. And I didn't think it was 5 years away then. And here we are living in a world with it.
So what are some of the other, potential applications of Evo 2? I mean, this is absolutely fascinating.
So I think, we've talked about the medical thing, which is sort of saying what might happen if we, introduce changes into the human genome, which ones might cause cancer, that sort of thing. But I think there's all of these other sort of like industrial applications of biology that we've barely begun scratching the surface of. Like I think about, for example, could we have, I'm just making this up. This is not something that the researchers, specifically said, but there's all these kinds of chemicals that are really complicated. So think about the difference between, a molecule like aspirin and a molecule like insulin. Aspirin is, I don't know, like 15 atoms and insulin is like 700 atoms. It's a much, much, much more complicated molecule. But we could start creating like factories that are, basically bacteria or algae or whatever, and they start creating chemicals that are maybe useful for industrial processes, maybe they're useful for medical processes. But the basic point is we have already had for a long time now CRISPR, which makes gene editing super simple and easy.
Right.
And now we have, Evo 2, which makes genetic simulation really cheap and easy. And so this future world of industrial biology powered by AI, I think it's coming to us full steam ahead.
And what are some of the dangers?
Well, if you can make good stuff, you can also make bad stuff.
Right.
And I think that's very real. Now, I'm hopeful, actually, that this is going to be used defensively first, because I think it's crystal clear that something like this could be weaponized for really, really dark use cases, right? Let's say you have bird flu, which in some strains of bird flu, the lethality, if a human contracts bird flu, is higher than 90%. So that's a highly lethal version of bird flu. Then there's other versions, like swine flu, for example, that are super duper contagious, but they're not super lethal. But what if you could use this sort of function prediction capability to come up with a new version of bird flu that is highly contagious and highly lethal, right? That's going to be apocalyptically bad. That would make COVID look like a walk in the park. But I think you could use this capability, this Evo 2 capability, defensively. Because what I mean by that is there's DNA synthesis companies where you send them a DNA sequence and they send you back, real DNA of that sequence that you asked for. They're basically like printers. They print the DNA for you. And what this capability could use is you could require all the DNA synthesis companies, you must scan all the DNA sequences that come to you and make sure that it's not going to be some super deadly pathogen that you're just giving away willy-nilly. Right now, a lot of the DNA synthesis companies, they just make whatever anybody asks for. I think the regulation is they have to check for like the 12 most common biological weapons that we were freaked out after 9/11. Like literally, that's all they have to check for, which bird flu is not on, COVID is not on, all these nasty pathogens that you could imagine bad folks wanting to do. It's just not on there. And so I think that this capability, of course, it has really bad offensive use cases, but it also has really good defensive use cases if the industry can get behind doing that and incorporating that into their processes.
Greg, great first podcast on video. Really appreciate your time today. We'll be back next week with more AI Policy Podcast. Appreciate it, buddy.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the AI Policy Podcast. If you like what you heard, there's an easy way for you to help us. please give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform and subscribe. And tell your friends. It really helps spread the word. This podcast was produced by Sarah Baker, Isaac Goldston, and Sadie McCullough. See you next time.